For decades, Hitler's favorite sister-in-law guarded the regime's most intimate secrets. She was there from the dazzling parties to the bitter end. But before her death, the last living insider finally broke her silence, telling a story of love, betrayal, and tragedy that only she could tell. This is the confession the world never heard. To understand the end of the story, one must first understand the beginning, in a world that seemed full of light and privilege. This is where we find Margaret Braun, known to everyone as Gretl. She was not a political schemer or an ideologue. She was the little sister, the fun one, the favorite. Gretl was the younger sister of Eva Braun, Hitler's last-minute wife, and that simple fact catapulted her into a life she could never otherwise have imagined. While history would later paint her as a footnote, Hitler's sister-in-law, in those pre-war years, she was the vivacious heart of the inner circle. She was the one whose laughter could cut through the tension, the one who represented a normality and youthful charm that was otherwise in short supply. Her world was one of granted luxuries. There was a spacious apartment in Munich, a gift from the regime, but the true center of this gilded life was the Berghof, Hitler's alpine retreat in Obersalzberg. From the outside, it was a picture postcard scene, a grand house nestled amongst breathtaking mountain peaks. Inside, it operated like a strange, formal court, full of generals and officials who moved with a stiff reverence. Yet Gretl navigated these halls with a disarming ease. She was the one who would be caught sneaking a cigarette, who loved American jazz music, and who brought a spark of irreverent life to the oppressive atmosphere. It was this very spirit that led to one of the most telling anecdotes about her unique position. During a relaxed afternoon at the Berghof, Hitler noticed Gretl with a cigarette. Smoking in his presence was generally frowned upon, and the room likely grew still, anticipating a reprimand. But Hitler, in an unusually playful mood, made her an extraordinary offer. He promised to gift her a beautiful villa, a life-changing prize, if she would simply give up her filthy habit. All eyes would have been on the young woman. It was an offer that was also a command, wrapped in immense generosity. To refuse was unthinkable. But Gretl, summoning all her nerves, met his gaze and offered a witty reply that would become legendary amongst those who were there. "My Führer," she said, her voice steady, "a villa would be a great joy to me, but only one, whereas smoking gives me 20 little satisfactions every day." The room held its breath. Then Adolf Hitler laughed. It was a genuine laugh of amusement. She had not only refused him, but had delighted him in doing so. In that moment, she wasn't just Eva's sister. She was Gretl, who had a unique power to disarm the most powerful man in Europe. That moment represented the peak of the illusion. It was a life of beautiful terraces and charming anecdotes, a bubble of privilege carefully insulated from the grim realities of the regime they served. They were young and living in a gilded cage, oblivious to the fact that the world outside was already beginning to burn. The price for those 20 little satisfactions would one day prove to be catastrophically high. But for Gretl Braun, dancing in the grand hall of the Berghof, that reckoning was still a world away. By the summer of 1944, the world that Gretl Braun had known was beginning to fray at the edges. The distant war was no longer so distant. Its echoes were reaching even the insulated halls of the Berghof. It was in this atmosphere of gathering gloom that a new figure entered the scene, a man whose arrival would tie Gretl's fate directly to the regime's inner machinery of power. His name was Hermann Fegelein, an SS Gruppenführer with a reputation for ambition and a charming, if slippery, demeanor. He was a career opportunist, a man who had risen through the ranks not just through military acumen, but through a keen sense of which connections mattered. As Heinrich Himmler's liaison officer to Hitler's headquarters, he had a front-row seat to power, and he was determined to secure his place. The courtship, if one could call it that, was swift and strategic. For Fegelein, marrying Gretl Braun was the ultimate social coup. It was not just a marriage into a family, it was a marriage into the innermost sanctum, a direct, familial link to Eva Braun and, by extension, to Hitler himself. For the Braun family, and perhaps for Eva most of all, it was a way to cement their status, to formalize their position within the circle they had inhabited for years. It was a transaction, draped in the finery of romance. The wedding, on the 3rd of June 1944, was a spectacle of denial. Held at the magnificent Mirabell Palace in Salzburg, it was a 3-day extravaganza, a final, desperate party for a regime on the brink. The guest list was a who's who of Nazi power. Adolf Hitler himself attended, acting as a formal witness. So too did the sinister Heinrich Himmler, Fegelein's patron, and the notoriously manipulative Martin Bormann. They all smiled for the cameras, toasting the happy couple as if the world were not crumbling around them. One can imagine the scene: the opulent halls, the lavish uniforms, the clinking of champagne glasses. Gretl, the beautiful bride, was the center of attention in a stunning white dress. Fegelein, every inch the dashing SS officer, played his part to perfection. It was the last great Nazi wedding, a festival of false normalcy. Behind the smiles, however, the timing was grotesque. Even as they danced, the Allies were finalizing plans for the D-Day landings, which would begin just 3 days later, on the 6th of June. The walls were literally closing in, but inside the bubble, they chose to celebrate. For Gretl, it must have been a whirlwind. She was marrying a powerful man, surrounded by the most important people in the Reich. It is easy to see how a young woman might be swept up in the fantasy, but the foundation of her new life was built on sand. She was marrying an opportunist, a man whose primary loyalty was to his own survival. The very qualities that had helped Fegelein climb so high were the ones that would, in the end, lead to his spectacular fall. The wedding was not a happy beginning, but the start of a countdown to tragedy. The champagne bubbles had barely faded before the bitter reality began to seep in. The gilded cage had become a tomb. By April 1945, the picturesque world of the Berghof, where Gretl Braun had once laughed and charmed her way through parties, was a distant memory. For Gretl, the reality of the war was shifting from a distant worry to a terrifying certainty. But for her sister and the inner circle in Berlin, there was only one place left to go: down. The descent into the Führerbunker was a journey into another world, a stark contrast to the sun-drenched Alps Gretl had loved. This was not a retreat. It was a fortress buried deep beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery. The air changed first. It grew thick and stale, carrying a constant damp chill. It smelled of concrete, damp earth, fuel, and the faint, metallic scent of fear. The bunker itself was a cramped, 2-level labyrinth of low-ceilinged rooms and narrow corridors. The lighting was a perpetual, sickly yellow, casting long shadows that danced with every earth-shattering explosion from above. There was no natural light, no fresh air, no sense of day or night. The only constant was the thunderous symphony of the Soviet advance. This claustrophobic underworld became the final stage for the key players, a drama from which Gretl was physically separated, but to which she was inextricably tied. Adolf Hitler, who had once joked with her about cigarettes, was now a pallid, stooped figure pacing the confined spaces. Yet amidst this decay, Eva Braun, Gretel's beloved sister, seemed strangely composed. By Hitler's side, she became a dedicated hostess in this subterranean hell. She ensured there was still champagne, she wore her best dresses, and she tried to maintain a facade of grace. It was a heartbreaking performance for an audience of the doomed. Then there were others like the Goebbels family, their 6 children's innocent games creating a jarring counterpoint to the regime's death rattles. They were all there, gathered in a concrete coffin. And while Gretl waited in the relative safety of the mountains, the despair of that bunker and the choices made within it would reach out and shape the entire course of her life, forever separating her from the world she had known. In the dark world of the bunker, where every whispered word carried the weight of doom, a single act of self-preservation was the ultimate crime. For Hermann Fegelein, the man who had married his way into the inner circle, the instinct for survival finally overrode his loyalty. And for his wife, Gretl, waiting anxiously hundreds of miles away, his actions would seal a fate she could never have imagined on their wedding day. As the Soviet noose tightened around Berlin in late April 1945, Fegelein, the SS liaison, began to vanish. He was conspicuously absent from his post in the bunker, his excuses for slipping away growing thinner with each passing hour. Then, he disappeared altogether. The regime, even in its death throes, had a long and vengeful reach. He was discovered not on the front lines, but in his own comfortable Berlin apartment. He was not in his SS uniform, the symbol of his power and allegiance. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a plain grey suit, a man trying to blend into a crowd that did not exist. The scene was one of quiet preparation for escape. He had packed belongings and, according to some accounts, had a significant amount of cash and jewelry on hand, the tools for a new anonymous life. Perhaps most damningly, he was allegedly drunk, his courage artificially fueled for the flight he was about to attempt. He was arrested and dragged back down into the bunker he had tried so hard to leave. His timing could not have been worse. Just as this personal betrayal was uncovered, a political earthquake shook the bunker to its core. News arrived that Heinrich Himmler, Fegelein's own mentor and the head of the SS, was secretly negotiating a surrender with the Allies. For Hitler, this was the ultimate treachery. The SS, his most fanatical and loyal creation, had been stabbed in the back by its own leader. And now, here was Himmler's man, Fegelein, caught in the very act of desertion. In Hitler's mind, the two betrayals became fused. Fegelein was not just a coward, he was a conspirator. He must have known of Himmler's plans. His attempt to flee was not just personal panic, but part of a wider, poisonous plot. The man who had sat at their table, who had married Gretl Braun, was a traitor. The fury that consumed Hitler was apocalyptic. The man who felt betrayed by the entire world now saw a traitor in his own family, quite literally. He ranted about the corruption that had rotted his regime from within. The fact that Fegelein was married to Gretl, to Eva's beloved sister, meant nothing. It may have even made the betrayal feel more personal, more bitter. In the cramped conference room, Hitler's rage echoed off the concrete walls, He screamed of treachery, of ropes and firing squads. The order was given. Fegelein was to be stripped of his rank and executed. There was to be no mercy, no consideration for the pregnant wife waiting in the Alps. There was no formal trial, only a swift and brutal court-martial in the bowels of the Reich Chancellery. The sentence was a foregone conclusion. On the 28th of April, Hermann Fegelein was taken up from the stifling darkness of the bunker into the hellish landscape of the garden. A world of rubble and fire, he had tried to escape and was shot by an SS firing squad. It was a blunt, ignoble end for the ambitious social climber. Far away, in the relative safety of the Berghof, a heavily pregnant Gretl Braun waited for news. She was surrounded by the ghost of her old life, the very place where she had once charmed the man who had now ordered her husband's death. She was awaiting the birth of their child, hoping for word from Hermann, perhaps a message that he was safe. The communication that would have finally reached her was not the one she expected. It would not have been a detailed report, just a terrible, stark truth. Hermann was dead, executed on the orders of the man she called uncle. The man who had laughed at her refusal to quit smoking had now ordered her husband shot. The marriage that had been designed to cement Gretl's place in the regime had ended in its most brutal and personal sacrifice. The inner circle was no longer a privilege. For Gretl Braun, it had become a slaughterhouse. As Gretl would later reveal, the execution of Hermann Fegelein did not bring order to the bunker. Instead, it unleashed a final, frantic energy. With the traitor purged, a strange and morbid sense of closure seemed to descend upon Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. The last loose end of their lives had been tied, and with it, the final performance of their relationship could begin. In the early hours of the 29th of April, less than 40 hours after Fegelein was shot, a bizarre ceremony took place in the bunker's map room. It was the wedding of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. There was no music, no flowers, and no guests from the bride's family. The air still felt thick with the ghost of her brother-in-law's death. Eva, wearing a simple black dress, stood beside Hitler, who was in his uniform. A city official, who had been summoned from his duties in the burning city, performed the civil ceremony. The couple swore they were of pure Aryan blood, a grotesque formality as their world collapsed into ash. They signed the marriage certificate, their names a stark contrast to the distant roar of Soviet guns. It was a bleak and hurried affair, a world away from the lavish three-day celebration Gretl had enjoyed at Mirabel Palace less than a year before. For Eva, this was her ultimate triumph and her final surrender. She had finally become Frau Hitler, just in time to die. Immediately after the wedding, a different ritual began. Hitler retired to dictate his last will and political testament. In these documents, he blamed the war on international Jewry, refusing to the very end to accept any responsibility for the catastrophe he had engineered. He appointed his successors, Admiral Donitz and Goebbels, and in a final, cruel twist, he formally expelled Hermann Fegelein and Heinrich Himmler from the party for their treason. The inked words on the page were the last, feeble commands of a man whose power had vanished. The following day, the 30th of April, was spent in a state of suspended animation. The mood was one of exhausted resignation. In the afternoon, Hitler and Eva said their goodbyes to the remaining staff and closest followers. The details would later be pieced together from those who were there. Eva Braun Hitler was calm, even serene. She had made her choice. She gave a final, sad smile to those present before she and her husband of less than 40 hours, retreated into their private sitting room. What happened inside that room is known from the grim discoveries made afterwards. There was no dramatic gunshot to signal the end of Eva's story. Having spent her life in the shadow of a pistol, she chose a different path. Eva Braun Hitler bit into a thin glass ampule of cyanide, its bitter almond scent a final perfume. Her husband also took cyanide, but to be certain, he simultaneously shot himself in the head. In that small, furnished room, the fantasy they had built together came to its brutal conclusion. For Gretl, when the news eventually reached her, the sequence of events would have been a horror to unravel. Her sister had become a bride in the very hours after her husband's execution. The marriage, the ultimate validation Eva had craved, was not a happy beginning, but a ticket to a shared grave. The man who had been a brother-in-law to them both had ordered one spouse killed before dying alongside the other. In the space of 2 days, Gretl Braun had lost her husband and her sister, the two people who had defined her place in this terrifying world. The fairy tale was over, and the reckoning had arrived. While Berlin fell and the world celebrated, a different kind of drama was unfolding in the quiet of the Alps. Just 5 days after the suicides in the bunker, on the 5th of May 1945, Gretl Braun gave birth to a baby girl. In a gesture of heartbreaking loyalty, or perhaps profound sorrow, she named the child Eva, after the sister she had just lost. It was a bittersweet moment, layered with a terrible complexity. Here was new life, a tiny, innocent girl, carrying the name of a woman the world now reviled, and the legacy of a father executed as a traitor. For Gretl, baby Eva must have been a living reminder of all she had loved and lost. The war was over, but for Gretl, the long shadow of the bunker stretched across the rest of her life. She had to learn to live in a new Germany, a country that wanted to forget the very people she had called family. The name Braun was a heavy burden to carry. Like others connected to the regime, she eventually changed it, seeking a degree of anonymity in a world that judged her past. She moved back to Munich, the city of her youth, but it was a different place now. She tried to build a normal life. In 1954, she remarried a man named Kurt Berlinghoff. It was a quiet, private ceremony, a world away from the spectacle of her first wedding. There were no powerful guests, no propaganda photographs. This was a life chosen for its obscurity, a conscious retreat from the glare of history. For a while, it might have seemed that a measure of peace was possible, but the tragedy that had defined her life was not finished with her. The past had a cruel grip on the future. Her daughter, Eva Fegelein, grew up bearing the weight of a name she had not chosen. In 1971, when she was just 26 years old, her boyfriend was killed in a car accident. The loss was too much to bear. Devastated by grief, Eva died by suicide, a tragic echo of the aunt whose name she carried. For Gretl, this was surely the final, crushing blow. She had lost her husband to a firing squad, her sister to cyanide, and now her daughter to a despair that seemed to run in the family's shadow. The child, who was meant to be a new beginning, had become a symbol of an inescapable end. Gretl lived for another 16 years after her daughter's death, a quiet life of unspoken grief. She died in 1987 in the town of Steingarten. She was buried not with any grand recognition of her former role, but simply, quietly, next to her daughter, her second husband, and her sister Ilse. In death, she returned to the family she was born into, the one that existed long before the name Hitler ever entered their lives. Her long silence was finally and permanently complete. The story that began in the heart of the Nazi elite ended in a quiet Bavarian churchyard, a lifetime away from the bunker's roar. While Berlin fell and the world celebrated, a different kind of drama was unfolding in the quiet of the Alps. Just 5 days after the suicides in the bunker, on the 5th of May, 1945, Gretl Braun gave birth to a baby girl. In a gesture of heartbreaking loyalty, or perhaps profound sorrow, she named the child Eva, after the sister she had just lost. It was a bittersweet moment, layered with a terrible complexity. Here was new life, a tiny, innocent girl, carrying the name of a woman the world now reviled, and the legacy of a father executed as a traitor. For Gretl, baby Eva must have been a living reminder of all she had loved and lost. The war was over, but for Gretl, the long shadow of the bunker stretched across the rest of her life. She had to learn to live in a new Germany, a country that wanted to forget the very people she had called family. The name Braun was a heavy burden to carry. Like others connected to the regime, she eventually changed it, seeking a degree of anonymity in a world that judged her past. She moved back to Munich, the city of her youth, but it was a different place now. She tried to build a normal life. In 1954, she remarried a man named Kurt Berlinghoff. It was a quiet, private ceremony, a world away from the spectacle of her first wedding. There were no powerful guests, no propaganda photographs. This was a life chosen for its obscurity, a conscious retreat from the glare of history. For a while, it might have seemed that a measure of peace was possible, but the tragedy that had defined her life was not finished with her. The past had a cruel grip on the future. Her daughter, Eva Fegelein, grew up bearing the weight of a name she had not chosen. In 1971, when she was just 26 years old, her boyfriend was killed in a car accident. The loss was too much to bear. Devastated by grief, Eva died by suicide, a tragic echo of the aunt whose name she carried. For Gretl, this was surely the final, crushing blow. She had lost her husband to a firing squad, her sister to cyanide, and now her daughter to a despair that seemed to run in the family's shadow. The child who was meant to be a new beginning had become a symbol of an inescapable end. Gretl lived for another 16 years after her daughter's death, a quiet life of unspoken grief. She died in 1987 in the town of Steingarten. She was buried not with any grand recognition of her former role, but simply, quietly, next to her daughter, her second husband, and her sister Ilse. In death, she returned to the family she was born into, the one that existed long before the name Hitler ever entered their lives. Her long silence was finally and permanently complete. The story that began in the heart of the Nazi elite ended in a quiet Bavarian churchyard, a lifetime away from the bunker's roar.